Your child is burning up. The fever came fast. 1 hour they were fine, the next the shaking, skin hot, eyes unfocused. You don't think, you react. Grab your keys, rush out the door, drive straight to the hospital. That's the system. That's what you've always done. But something feels wrong before you even get there. The parking lot is too empty. No ambulances, no movement, just a few cars scattered like they've been there for days. You walk to the entrance, doors locked, lights off inside, a printed notice taped to the glass already curling at the edges. Closed. You check your phone, no signal. Try calling anyway, nothing connects. You try another number, emergency services, still nothing. Pause for a second, because this is the moment everything shifts. You're not dealing with a delay. You're not waiting in a long line. The system you rely on, the one that always existed in the background, is simply gone. And now the question isn't how long until help arrives, it's what do you do when it doesn't? You go back to the car. Your child is still there, still burning with fever. The medicine you need isn't expensive, it's not rare. In a normal world, it's everywhere. But right now, it might as well not exist. And that's the part most people never prepare for. Not the disease, the absence of the system that treats it.
This is where most people instinctively go in the wrong direction. They imagine that scenario, no hospitals, no doctors, no supply chain, and immediately jump to one conclusion: I need more medicine. So they start thinking about antibiotics, painkillers, antivirals, filling a cabinet with supplies as if they can rebuild the system at home. On the surface, it feels logical. If access disappears, you replace access with storage. But that assumption has a flaw most people don't see at first. Medicine without understanding is limited and sometimes dangerous. Not every fever is bacterial. Not every infection needs antibiotics. And if you use the wrong treatment, you don't just fail to solve the problem, you can make it worse. You can suppress symptoms while the real issue continues underneath. You can create resistance. You can burn through limited supplies on something that was never going to respond to that treatment in the first place. In a normal system, mistakes get corrected. In a constrained one, mistakes compound. Now add another layer: time. Most medications degrade. Some slowly lose potency, others become unreliable after a certain point. Unless you're constantly rotating and managing your supply, what looks like preparation can quietly decay into something ineffective. And in a moment where you need certainty, you're left with doubt. Pause for a second and think about what that means. Stockpiling assumes the problem is access to treatment. But in a real breakdown, the deeper issue is something else entirely. It's understanding cause. If you don't know why someone is sick, whether it's contaminated water, poor sanitation, malnutrition, or exposure, then treatment becomes guesswork. And guesswork in a limited environment is expensive. Because you don't have infinite retries. You don't have backup systems. Every decision carries weight. And this is where the focus has to shift, not toward treating everything, but toward needing to treat less in the first place. Historically, when medical systems fail, most deaths don't come from rare diseases or complex conditions. They come from simple, preventable problems: infected wounds, dehydration, unsafe water, poor hygiene. Things that modern systems quietly solved in the background so well that people stopped thinking about them. That's the uncomfortable truth. A cabinet full of medicine can give you confidence, but it doesn't replace the foundation that makes medicine effective: clean environments, correct diagnosis, proper usage, and consistent supply. Without that foundation, supplies alone don't carry you very far. So the question changes in a way that feels almost too simple. Not what should I store, but what keeps people from getting sick when there's nothing left to treat them.
If you want to understand what actually keeps people alive when the system fails, you don't start with theory. You look at what already happened. Because there have been recent moments where modern medical systems didn't disappear completely, but degraded enough to reveal what really matters. Take the Venezuelan crisis. Hospitals didn't all vanish overnight, but they stopped functioning the way people expected. Supplies ran out, pharmacies emptied, equipment broke and wasn't replaced, doctors left.
What remained was a shell of a system, still standing, but unable to deliver consistent care. And this is where things get interesting, because not everyone experienced that collapse the same way. On one side, you had people who were completely dependent on the formal system. They relied on pharmacies for medication, hospitals for treatment, and centralized infrastructure for basic health needs. When that system weakened, they had nothing to fall back on. Even minor conditions became serious. Infections went untreated. Chronic issues escalated. Small problems turned into emergencies simply because the normal response was no longer available. On the other side, you had smaller pockets of resilience. Not perfect, not immune, but different. These were communities that adapted, not by replacing hospitals, but by reducing how much they needed them. They focused on basics, clean water when possible, shared resources, informal networks of knowledge, someone who understood basic care, someone who could identify early signs of infection, someone who knew how to manage wounds before they became critical. Pause for a second, because this is the pattern that repeats. The difference wasn't access to advanced medicine. It was exposure to preventable problems. When clean water becomes unreliable, illness spreads faster. When sanitation breaks down, infections increase. When nutrition declines, immune systems weaken. These are the underlying layers that determine whether people get sick in the first place. And when those layers fail, no amount of last-minute treatment can keep up. Now think about how most people prepare. They focus on the end point, the hospital, the medication, the emergency response. But in a breakdown, that end point is exactly what disappears first. What remains are the conditions that create illness. So the real divide isn't between people who had medicine and people who didn't. It's between people who were exposed to those conditions and people who managed to reduce that exposure. In Venezuela, this showed up in subtle ways. Families that could secure cleaner water sources had fewer gastrointestinal illnesses. Communities that maintained basic hygiene practices saw fewer infections. Those who shared knowledge, how to treat dehydration, how to clean wounds properly, how to recognize early symptoms, had better outcomes, even without access to formal care. It wasn't about perfection, it was about margin. Reducing the number of things that could go wrong in a situation where you couldn't fix everything once it did. And this is the uncomfortable insight. Modern medicine didn't just give us treatment, it allowed us to ignore prevention. It created a buffer so strong that people stopped thinking about the conditions that lead to illness in the first place. But once that buffer weakens, those conditions come back, fast. And when they do, survival isn't determined by who has the most supplies. It's determined by who understands the fundamentals. Who can keep water safe? Who can maintain hygiene? Who can act early before a problem escalates? Because in a system that's no longer there to catch you, the difference between a minor issue and a fatal one becomes very small and very personal. Which brings us to the most overlooked factor of all, the thing that quietly prevents more deaths than any medicine ever could. If you strip modern medicine down to its most fundamental breakthrough, it's not a drug, it's sanitation. More specifically, control over waterborne diseases. Before modern infrastructure, people didn't primarily die from rare conditions. They died from contaminated water. Bacteria, parasites, pathogens, things you can't see, can't taste, but once inside the body, they take over quickly. Diarrhea, dehydration, infections, these weren't side issues, they were leading causes of death. And the solution wasn't advanced, it was clean water. Pause for a second, because this is where the priority flips. Most people think survival in a medical collapse means access to treatment, but historically, the biggest gains in human survival didn't come from treatment, they came from prevention. Specifically, separating waste from water and ensuring that what people drink doesn't carry disease. Once that boundary is broken, everything accelerates in the wrong direction. You don't just get one illness, you get many. Entire households get sick at the same time. Dehydration compounds the problem. Weak immune systems make recovery harder. And without a functioning healthcare system, something that would normally be manageable becomes dangerous very quickly. Now, bring that into a modern collapse scenario. Water systems rely on infrastructure, pumps, treatment facilities, chemical inputs, maintenance crews. If that system becomes unreliable, even temporarily, the quality of water can degrade. Not always visibly. Sometimes it still looks clear, tastes normal, but it's no longer safe. And this is what makes it dangerous. You don't get a warning. The first sign is usually someone getting sick, and by then the source has already affected more than one person. Now, think about how this plays out over time. One contaminated source leads to illness. Illness leads to weakness. Weakness reduces the ability to maintain hygiene or secure better water. And that creates a loop, each step making the next one harder to break. That's how outbreaks form, not from rare pathogens, but from basic failures in sanitation. And this is why water becomes the foundation of survival. Not food, not medicine. Water. Because if water is compromised, everything else becomes harder to maintain. Nutrition matters less if the body can't absorb it. Medicine matters less if the environment keeps reintroducing the problem. So the priority becomes simple. You don't assume water is safe, you make it safe. That means filtration, boiling, chemical treatment, multiple layers if possible. It also means protecting the source. Keeping storage clean, separating waste, avoiding cross-contamination. And here's the key. This isn't about perfection, it's about consistency. You don't need a hospital to prevent most waterborne illness, but you do need discipline. Every time water is handled, stored, consumed, the process matters. Because in a system where treatment is limited, prevention becomes everything. And clean water is where that prevention begins. Which leads to something even less obvious, but just as critical. Because even if you get water right, you're still not surviving alone. This is the part most people underestimate, because it doesn't feel like preparation. It feels like people. When you imagine a system collapse, it's easy to picture isolation. You and your supplies separated from everything else, self-sufficient, independent. That idea is appealing, clean, controlled, but it's not how survival actually works. Because no matter how much you prepare, you don't replace an entire medical system on your own. You don't become a doctor, a pharmacist, a technician, and a caregiver all at once. There are gaps, knowledge gaps, skill gaps, blind spots you won't see until it's too late. And that's where other people become the system. Pause for a second. Think about the value of a retired nurse living 3 houses down. Someone who's seen infections before they escalate. Someone who knows when a fever is dangerous and when it isn't. Someone who understands basic wound care, hydration, dosage, not from theory, but from repetition. In a functioning system, that person is just another neighbor. In a failing system, they become critical infrastructure. Now multiply that. Someone who understands water filtration, someone who can repair basic equipment, someone who grows food, someone who can organize, communicate, coordinate. None of these roles replace a hospital, but together they reduce how often you need one. And that's the shift. Survival stops being individual. It becomes distributed. Because knowledge spreads across people. Skills overlap. Resources get shared. One person's limitation gets covered by someone else's capability. And that creates resilience. Not perfect, not guaranteed, but stronger than isolation. Now compare that to going alone. You might have supplies, you might have plans, but when something unexpected happens, and it will, you're relying entirely on what you personally know and what you personally have. No second opinion. No extra hands, no alternative perspective. And in a medical situation, that's a dangerous place to be. This is why communities that already have some level of connection tend to perform better in crises, not because they're more prepared in a traditional sense, but because they can adapt faster. They share information, they coordinate responses, they solve problems collectively. It's not efficient, but it works. And this leads to a simple, uncomfortable realization. The strongest survival asset isn't something you store, it's something you build over time. Trust, familiarity, a basic network of people who know each other well enough to act when it matters. Because when the system disappears, the only system left is the one around you.
So what does all of this actually look like in practice? Not a bunker full of pills, not a fantasy of replacing hospitals, just a shift in priorities, away from treatment toward the conditions that make treatment unnecessary in the first place. Start with water. If you get nothing else right, get this right. A reliable way to secure, filter, and store clean water isn't optional, it's foundational. That means thinking beyond convenience, multiple methods if possible: filtration, boiling, chemical backup, and just as important, clean storage, because even safe water becomes dangerous if it's handled carelessly. Then move to hygiene. This is where most people underestimate the impact. Clean hands, clean surfaces, proper waste management. These sound basic, but they're the barrier between minor exposure and full-blown infection. In a system with no backup, small lapses compound quickly. So the goal isn't perfection, it's consistency. Everyday habits that reduce risk before it starts. Next is nutrition. Not in the abstract sense of healthy eating, but in terms of resilience. A body that's consistently nourished handles stress, infection, and recovery better than one that isn't. That means stable access to calories, but also enough variety to avoid long-term deficiencies. It doesn't have to be complicated, but it has to be steady. Then layer in knowledge. Basic understanding of symptoms, hydration, wound care, early intervention, not to replace professionals, but to bridge the gap when they're not available. Knowing when something is escalating and acting early is often the difference between a manageable situation and a crisis. And finally, people. Everything above becomes more effective when it's not just you, when knowledge is shared, when responsibilities overlap, when someone else can step in if you can't. Pause for a second, because this protocol isn't about building a parallel medical system. It's about reducing how often you need one. Water, hygiene, nutrition, knowledge, community. Not impressive, not high-tech, but these are the things that keep people alive when everything else disappears. And once you see that, the hospital was never the first line of defense. It was the last.